This conference will now be recorded.
We have Carrie is here and is our faithful leader. And I am one of your co-chairs. And do we have Doug? Did Doug make it on? I don't see him signed in yet. Okay. Anyway, today's theme is going to be focusing on living shorelines. Our last meeting, we took a focus on oysters. So, be thinking about what we want to be happening the next meeting. If we want another theme, if we want to do it in person, etc. But I will let Tom Reese from Ecosphere go ahead and give us hopefully some advice on living shorelines. Thank you.
Give me a second here and I'll pull up your presentation, Tom.
Thanks, Carrie, and thanks, Jamie. Yes, I'd like to talk about living shorelines. Now, this audience is really well versed in this, okay? So it's not like my usual presentations where I have to talk about why it's even important to have a living shoreline. I think this audience understands that. So we're gonna pretty much jump right in. And so, again, what I would like to do today is talk about living shoreline status and trends for the Tampa Bay area in particular, and lessons learned over doing these for a long time. So if we can go to the first slide. I left this in here because I start all my living shoreline projects with this, but again, with this audience, but I have to emphasize the left side is upland and the right side is open water, and everything in between is where all the life is. We all know that. Next slide. The problem is when we take that zone out, right? And we put in a vertical wall. All we have now is upland and open water. There is no life or very little life in between. It's gone. And so, yes, these are useful. Some places we should and need to if we're going to develop in high energy places. Next slide. Then we need seawalls. And if you're going to live here, you better have a seawall, you better have a raised house, and you better have an evacuation plan, because someday you're going to have some energy hitting here and you don't want to be here at that moment. And so the problem is this same wall continues, next slide, back into these small bay and embayments where there really isn't any energy. And so those places we shouldn't have had a seawall in the first place. This slide shows here how prevalent living shoreline, seawalls are nationally. And this is focusing on the East Coast, but you can see Brevard counties, it's 80% of all their shoreline is vertical walls. Pinellas County is in the 70s range, depends on what parts, some places even higher in Boca Ciega Bay. And so it is a big issue when you put these in, and we know we're losing all this ecosystem services. So next slide. On top of just hardening the natural shoreline, we made more shoreline, and all this artificial dredge and fill that happened starting in the 50s through the 70s. In this picture alone, there's 30 miles of hardened shoreline. Doesn't look like it, but you add up every one of these edges and all around, that's 30 miles. So it is a big deal. And so what have people been doing about it? What are we doing today? Are we still putting hardened shorelines in? And the answer is yes, because it's not set up to first do a natural shoreline or a nature-based shoreline. And so I'll go to the next slide. And in 2015, we had to do a study to just see where all the living shoreline permits were issued by DEP and the state. And this is what it was in 2015. You can see there's a major concentration in the Tampa Bay area, some on the East Coast. We were focusing on in the central Florida. So yes, there's some down further south and some in the Panhandle. But in this area, there's really a lot of living shorelines already in place by 2015. Next slide is a graphic that was put out a year or so later that just concentrated on the interior Tampa Bay area. And you can see these, and they're color coded with the blues being projects that were existing, and the other yellow ones are one in progress. And even this wasn't totally up to date. So what I tried to do is put together a summary of living shoreline projects in this area. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see it's very busy, but what this is two tables, okay, where the project name, description, and owner and the year, and they're next to each other. And you can see starting in the 90s, yeah, we had maybe one every year or every other year, but as time went on, more and more started coming in, and it especially started ramping up in 2015, 2016. We're doing like 3 or 4 projects a year. But when you get down to 2020, we have, I think, 17 projects in there up to 23. So it's really ramped up. 2 reasons. One, first of all, people are starting to understand that there's options. And one of the major reasons, there's funding, right? DEP funding, federal funding. Local agencies are starting to emphasize and incentivize, at least with dollars, these projects. Now, I wanted to there's a lot going on here, and I want to emphasize, these are not all living shoreline projects. I just put projects on. There's 58 projects on here. And I put projects on that I had some involvement with or knew about enough so I could fill out this table, right? So of the 58 that's on here, 53 of those I was somehow involved with. So I had all this information, I put it on here. And of all these projects that had nature-based shorelines or somewhat enhancement activities, the green ones, which are ones that seawalls were completely taken out and replaced with a true living shoreline. You can see there's only 7 of them out here. So there's only 12% of all of these on this table that we're actually taking seawalls out. We should do more of that when we can, but those are harder to find because there's issues if you're next to another seawall. You know, how do you handle the remaining seawalls? It's hard to cut a hole in your seawall. We've done it. We've done it on projects, but it is not the norm. And the yellow ones are what I call seawall enhancement projects. These are not living shorelines. They are still a wall standing there, but we put stuff in front of the wall to provide ecosystem services. It is not, doesn't have the resiliency for sea level rise, but for the next 20, maybe 30 years, they will provide ecosystem services and still have the wall there since the wall could not be removed. That just shows the majority of the 75% ended up being real living shorelines on this list here. Like I said, I don't have Tampa Bay watches, and I know there was some done down in Sarasota that I didn't have enough information for. And through GIPR reporting, I know this can be tracked, but I'll be glad to send this table out and folks could add to it, right? They know their projects better than I do. One of them in here in 2001, the city of Tampa had this initiative called Tampa Shoreline Restoration Initiative. And under that, there were 10 separate projects. We were hired by them to put all those in. So I have them as a footnote, those 10 projects where they were, most of them, all of them in Tampa, a lot of them on the river. And so this is a pretty good list to work from. And so what I like to do now is talk about what's unique about these projects, what have we learned in doing all these type projects, critical elements. So let's go to the first example, next slide, and talk about this. This is on the Hillsborough River near downtown. What you see here is Stewart Middle School. It's about 1,800 plus linear feet. This was right after it was restored into a living shoreline. And what this shows is that this is all caused by boat wakes. So it's really important to note that some of the things that is, no one size fits all, right? The design we came up here fits. It's been in the ground for over 10 years. It's working, even though there's more boat traffic than before. And plus, this is a transition in 2 places of no wake and wake. And so what that means on both those sections, boats are coming off a plane and coming on a plane again, and that doubles your boat wake. And yet this shoreline totally held. We're doing right across the river. There's 3 homeowners there on that property that's jutting out. They all want to do a living shoreline. We're going to use the same exact design that we did at Stewart Middle School across the river because it's all the same energy conditions, same depth, same water type, same salinity. And so you can use some of these designs and expand them, but one size does not fit all, and it's very important to know that. So let's go through a series of slides so I can show you what was done here. And so the next slide, you'll see what it looked like before. These are 70 to 80 foot high lead trees down the entire length. You can't see the school. The school can't use the river as a learning lab. And there's a 3 to 4 foot escarpment underneath this that you can't even see. And so it was pretty much a dead zone for the school. So next slide, you can see we went in there working with the swim program and funding that we got from NIFWIF. We were able to remove all the lead trees, next slide, and then try and soften the bank. This is a design that we put for the entire length. Real simple, 2 foot across breakwater that's about 1 foot high above natural grade, a little wetland trough on the landward side, and then we slope the bank. Now there's a lot of infrastructure here. The best slope we had anywhere was 3 to 1. A lot of places it ended up being 2 to 1, and so we had to terrace it because there's just not enough room to pull back the bank to get a nice 4 or 6 to 1, which would be the optimal slope for a living shoreline to accommodate sea level rise. Next slide, please. This is what it looks like. It's under construction. There's your little breakwater. There's a trough. This is really high tide picture. You can see here where it's a 2 to 1 slope. That's not going to hold. So we had to put GeoWeb in a terracing manner. Next slide. You'll get to see that. We use GeoWeb everywhere or coconut mat. In the upper picture, you can see how we were terracing the GeoWeb, and we had like about 6 steps of that or 6 layers of that. And even then we had to put a fence around it because we didn't want the students from an middle school, falling down into the river. So most of it was filled with gravel, except for the terracing. The outer cells were filled with sediment so we could plant that. Next slide, please. Here you can see this was in 3 months later. Here's a terrace area. Again, it was required for a fence. We have 2 of these sections like this, and you can see how well the plants are doing. As a lark, I just put in some alternative flora out in front of the rocks, thinking it would have no chance of survival at all because that's where all the wave energy is. But if you look at the next slide, this is 1 year later, it completely filled in on its own from just a few plants planted in front of the rock. You can see just a glimpse of the rock there. That rock is running all the way down to Ricks on the River, which is upriver here, and goes all the way to North Boulevard Bridge. So in the next slide, it shows you 10 years later. And you can't see that there's the rock revetment in here. It looks like a natural shoreline. And like I said, we have no erosion. Even up to today, there is no erosion on this shoreline. So even in tight quarters like this, you can put a living shoreline in. And so I think it's a great example of a long section of living shoreline in a moderate to low energy thing. If there was no boats, this would be low energy, but there's boats and going off and off, up and off plane, and that's causing a fair amount of wake. So let's go to another example, which is high energy. Next slide. This is Safety Harbor, and this is above Old Tampa Bay, above the Courtney Campbell, in the city of Safety Harbor. There's almost 6 miles to the east of open water fetch, and that's why I did this zoomed out picture. You can see there's a lot of open water here and not a lot of protection. Next slide, you can see we're zoomed in, and you can see where the seawall is. It looks like 2 seawalls, but really the one waterward is the seawall and the one above it is a fence. And they had to put the fence up because that seawall was in such bad repair, it was dangerous for the public to be on here. So next slide, I'll show you what it looked like before we started. There it is. As you can see, the seawall is in bad shape. The city was just going to replace it. I got wind of it. I presented to them and said, look, there's better alternatives even in high energy. They were not supportive. The only way we got them to even consider it, I said, is there's not a single grant that I know that will provide money to build a new seawall or replace it. But there are grants out there that'll fund this thing to put in a nature-based shoreline or living shoreline. So it barely passed by city council, but it did pass. Next slide, and this is what it looked like afterwards. Okay, now the seawall is gone. It's not completely gone. We cut it at the mud line, and I'll show you in another picture. And we use that as a base to put an oyster bag array in. Then we put rocks in. This is a high energy. You can't just put some plants in and think it's going to be okay. When we put this in, next slide, this is from the pier, or actually from a drone, but from the water we're facing in. If you look closely at the bottom, at the toe of the rocks, that's where the oyster bags are, and they are sitting physically where the seawall, the remaining seawall that's in the mud, was left. We cut it, and that was leaving it in place to really provide a solid base for us to put the oyster bags in. So this was in the ground about 9 months before we had its first really energy, and that was Hurricane Ida. That was 2 days of relentless winds from the east, which is where this high energy is. So next slide, after that hurricane came through, I went out the very next day to see how well this fared. And in the upper picture here, you can see, yeah, we lost a couple plants up where the sod line is, but the rocks all held, no erosion at all as far as the bank is concerned. It really held a Cat 2 storm. And then the bottom picture, that fence that you can see in the upper picture goes all the way to the north. And you can see the waves were punched out the boards of the fence. That's to show you how elevated the water was and how high the energy was, and yet it held. And so that was very, reassuring, because we hadn't done a lot in an open energy like this. But with the right modeling, you can come up with a great design. And I'd like to go on to another one, but I do want to talk about design considerations because it's so important. I already drove home the fact that one size does not fit all. Each side's unique. Got to know what's going on. A coastal conditions analysis done by an engineer is critical. The good news in this area, we have multiple airports. They all have over 100 years of daily wind. And so you have a really good picture. Intensities, extreme, normal prevailing winds. And with that, you can design the right material, the density of the material, the weight of the material, and the orientation of the material to withstand what we have 100 years of record for. And so with doing that, it's imperative. And it's not just wave energy. You got to know what the substrate is out there. Is it all soft sediments? Well, you can't just put this out there without sinking. You got to know the salinity of the area. Is there any EFH, any sort of essential fish habitat? And that includes seagrass, mangroves, or oysters. And you have to avoid all that. And so every site needs to be analyzed to do this. And so it's an important component. I'd like to now go to the intercoastal on Boca Ciega Bay. Next slide, please. Treasure Island. The city of Treasure Island owns the northern piece of this man-made peninsula. It is a little par 3 golf course and tennis courts. And the city is very progressive and really was interested in doing something. Their seawall is failing, and at 3,800 linear feet, that's a lot of dollars, okay, millions for them to replace that. So the city engineer, very progressive, was trying to find a way to do something else. So we got involved with this project, helped them get funding through DEP at a tune of over $1.2 million. And so what are we going to do with this design here? Now, I don't have a good picture here, but to the north of this is a cove. You can see that little marina in there. To the west of this picture, you're on the ICW. And even though it's a no wake zone, most boats are plowing because they don't understand what no wake is and they're in a hurry. And so they're actually making bigger wake than if they were going at high speed. So there is energy on the intercoastal side. You cannot make the same design throughout. So we have to have two different designs and a transition. So next slide, we're going to zoom in to the north side, and you will see there where there's no energy and there's a lot of land on the upland, we are making a true living shoreline. We're completely taking the seawall out, which is that purple line, and removing it completely, cutting it at mud line, sloping it up at a 6-to-1 slope. There's plenty of room to do this. We are going to put some rock in the water, which is the white, just to have something to hold our new slope in place. But everything is going to be planted with native vegetation, and as sea level rises, the community can move, the vegetative community can move uphill because there's plenty of slope. You'll also see that gray sidewalk, which is on the upland side of everything. That's a new sidewalk pedestrian walkway we're putting in, and we're putting it in at elevation 5. The seawall sitting in here right now is sitting at 3.9. And so we are providing resiliency with that sidewalk, and that'll be continuous throughout the whole project. And that is the elevation that the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council has come up with through 2060. So they're going to have some areas we're going to have kayak launches. Right now, if you're kayaking, all you see anywhere in this area is seawalls, but now you'll have a natural shoreline for about 800 or 900 feet. The next slide, as we go to the east and around the corner in the intercoastal waterway, we start transitioning to where we have to leave the shoreline on the east side where it says South Pond, North Pond. All that is going to, the seawall is going to be left in place. We're going to cut the cap off because that's completely no good. And then we're going to put a little bit of rock in front of it. And then we're going to put some rock behind it up to the sidewalk. And then there's an area where it's going to be planted. So on the high energy side, because of the boat wakes, we do need to have some more protection in here. There is a lot of EFH in this site. There's actually corals, 2 or 3 species of hard coral, not counting whips and all those types of soft corals. And so we want to encourage more of that. And so we're going to be putting a little bit more rock in, but without disturbing the shoreline. Side note, these ponds are full of legacy pesticides, and so they're going to be all dredged out, replaced, not directly connected to the bay anymore. They're going to have littoral shelves, and only during high water conditions will they drain out. And so we'll have some water quality improvements and some habitat improvements on this site. This project is in permitting as we speak. It's going to be evaluated. We have 2 more slides. If you can go to the next one, I want to show you the cross sections of some of this stuff so it's easier to understand what's happening. The first slide right here is more where we're taking the bank completely out and making it a living shoreline. And then if you go to the next slide, we are on the intercoastal side where there's not as much room. So we're putting oyster domes out in front of the hard substrate that's down there that has now oysters and corals on it. And then we're going to have a slope leaving a section of the wall in, as I mentioned. So these are projects that are seawalls that half of it's can be completely taken out and the other half is being modified to be a lot more user-friendly as far as from the ecological side. Next slide, I'd like to talk about places where we cannot take the seawall out. There's too much infrastructure, but you can do stuff in front of it. Again, these are not living shorelines. There is no room for stuff to go up slope, okay? The city is gonna have to do something here in the future, but for now, where this was a desert before with a vertical wall, now we have all kinds of life in here. So we put rock in. When we came to the intertidal zone, we put filter fabric in, sediments 18 inches, wrapped it in filter fabric so it doesn't get released into the water, and added some more rock. We did 2 tiers of this. The upper tier was planted with marsh, the lower tier was planted with red mangroves. Next slide will show you how that started to look within about, well, first of all, this is this cross section. You can see in here, this is a sediment tube. 3 of these polygons had 2 levels of it, which I was just describing. This one just has 1. And then the rock continues down here underwater to the bottom of the floor in front of the seawall. But that sediment tube is amazing. That small little tube there, it's amazing what you can grow in that. So the next slide, I'll show you what we planted. We planted red mangroves in the front and marsh in the back. And we had a 100% survival of these mangroves. And since it's pretty fresh here, this is on the Hillsborough River at Eulalie, they really took off. Next slide is 4 years later. These are 7-foot high mangroves. Now they're still not blocking view, but at some point they would block view. The city doesn't want to lose their view. So you can trim mangroves like this, just taking the tops off, but they are providing ecosystem services. Now there's all kinds of fish in here. We've pulled seines in here and got 4 or 5 different species of fish, crabs, crustaceans, birds. I mean, it's really amazing the transformation. And what if the entire river, it's 3 miles from here to the Hillsborough Bay, both sides, solid seawall all the way down. What if we had that? Now, this was an experimental situation. We went 15 feet out, not knowing how to do this. We can do this in 10 feet. And so that takes care of the sovereign submerged lands issues, and you still would have a ribbon, a veneer of life all the way down to the bay. And I'm telling you, that would massively improve the conditions. Currently, if boats are flying through here, downstream of here, it takes 3 wave sets before they annihilate themselves. So the waves go back 3 times from every single boat. And when there is no refraction from the waves where these things are. And so this is what we should do, right? I mean, you don't have to be this wide. And again, these aren't fixing it completely because it doesn't provide a lot of resiliency for 60 years from now when we have, you know, at least another foot of sea level rise. All right, I'm just going to show you just single pictures of other projects where we've put the seawall enhancement project. Next one in is a development down in Perico in Manatee County. They just had a seawall here. We talked them into putting rock in, which is important. You should do that. If you do nothing else in front of your seawall, you should put rock there so it doesn't scour the bottom of your seawall out to protect your seawall. But more importantly, it provides interstitial spaces. We had them come up high enough, put sediment tubes, and this was right after it was planted. You can see railroad vine and other plants starting to grow. I don't have a current picture, but last time I was there, it's completely grown in. It looks really good. Next slide. This is in the Sarasota, downtown Sarasota, Bayfront Park. This is O'Leary's. Pretty high energy here. If you look out through this picture on the left, that opening is the Gulf of Mexico. So that little window brings in a lot of energy here. We did for the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program a true living shoreline at this park, but it was up around the bend to the north away from that opening. And that's held for 15 years now. So this is something that the reef ball folks have done. They use reef balls and put these shelves in. There is no vegetation growing in here. So I'm not a big proponent of having no vegetation growing in here, but it does provide wave energy dissipation. It does provide a lot of interstitial spaces. There are a lot of crabs and crustaceans and living here. So it has a place in high energy locations. So I wanted to show you a couple more examples here. This is up in Indian Rocks Beach, a seawalled area, and yet we have 7-foot width of mangroves growing. And yes, they're 6 and 7 feet high, but they're not blocking a view. This is taken down by the water. If you're standing on the property, you can look right over them. And again, this provides a lot of life, a lot of resiliency as far as for wave energy, and you don't lose your view shed. Okay. The last slide, project working with Pinellas County. This is again an existing seawall at a road, no room to peel back that or anything, but some existing rock. All we did is put oyster bags in front, a couple oyster domes, planted, and it went from a stark nothing but rock and water to this. And so these aren't hard to do. Well, they are in some ways because you have to go through permitting. And so I'd like to stop here with all the slides and just spend about 5 more minutes just talking about lessons learned and issues that I see with living shorelines. And so when I talk to people about living shorelines, the funny thing is, the first thing I want to know is, do they work? Because they are skeptical. The second thing they want to know, am I losing my view shed? Which is a surprise to me. You would think it would be, hey, how much does this cost? But it's more important for view shed. So we have to make sure we address that if you're talking to people, that you can trim these. You won't lose your view shed. And then cost. Every living shoreline project I've ever put in or been involved with, and that's 53 of them in this area alone, it was cheaper than putting a brand new wall in. There's no exceptions. So first of all, it's cheaper. You never have to replace it. Aesthetics are better. Ecosystem services are provided. So there's really no reason not to do it, except people don't know. But there is one reason why it's hard to do, and that's called permitting. Because right now, if you have a seawall and you want to replace it, there is no permit required. It's an exemption. As long as you stay within 18 inches, put your new vinyl wall in or pour a new concrete slab, have at it. But if you want to take that out and put a living shoreline in, or even a seawall enhancement project in, well, you've tripped into the full-blown permitting, which is 6-9 months if you're good at it, and a ton of money. So what a disincentive that is. And then if you are a private landowner, you have to have an engineered, signed and sealed design. Well, what does that cost, right? And so these are the big impediments for this. And so we're doing a project working with the Tampa Bay SREP program in the city of St. Pete, where we're doing 3 neighbors' houses, working with the city that co-owns the land, and put in a living shoreline design. That design, signed and sealed design, will be handed for free to the other 78 homeowners in that vicinity that all have the exact same conditions. So there's no excuse then. Yes, they still have to get a permit, but permitting is only about 20% of the cost. That engineering design and signed and sealed plans is the rest of the cost. So we're trying to make it easier. We have to fix permitting. That's one thing that really we have to fix. And so I could have shown projects where projects have completely failed. And that was because they did not do a coastal conditions analysis. They put the wrong design in, and it was catastrophic failure. And then somebody else had to come in, happened to be an engineering firm that we were working with, that put in a design, and that's holding up perfectly. You just got to know that your energy conditions. And so in summary, each site's unique. You got to know your site, got to make sure you know what caused the erosion in the first place and address that. And then you can put living shorelines in, or if you can't, you can at least do a seawall enhancement. And so I hope I didn't go too quick and or confuse this, but for me, it's permitting. We really need help on that, and I will stop talking here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was great. Does anybody have any questions for Tom? We've got a few minutes. You can either unmute yourself or, let's see, Mark or Rachel, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great presentation, Tom. I appreciate seeing all those different projects. The rock we used, was it exclusively limestone, or did you? I'm just asking the question because I know in Hillsborough Bay, the port and core have moved to using granite just because of the wave energies. I know it's a different system than the intracoastal, but I'm just wondering about what you're seeing with whether limestone can hold up to most of the wave energies.
Hey, Mark, that's a good question. So far, every project we've done over here on this side of the state, we've used limestone because the hardness fit the coastal condition analysis. In other words, the type waves. Now, projects that we've done on the East Coast that are sitting at Sebastian Inlet, for example, that's granite. Okay, over here, we got 500 miles of energy on the Gulf, and they have 5,000 miles of energy on the Atlantic. So they use granite there because the density that's what's required. But I don't think we really need any of the modelings that I've worked with the engineers from different firms. All of them go to limestone because, first of all, it's cheaper and it has a density that's sufficient for the waves that we get here.
Do we have any other questions?
Mark Walton in the chat has asked, is there an exemption for living shorelines? And he includes a link to DEP, I guess.
And I only saw that link for a second. Was that a link for the state permit, or what? Can you see it from his question?
Let's see. It goes to a homeowner's guide to the living shoreline permit exemption part 1 FDEP.
Yeah, there are exemptions to just put plants in. Those are low energy environments, but usually when there's somebody wanting to do something, that means there's erosion, right? They're not going out there to fix something that's not broken. So every time we get pulled into the project, there's erosion. And so when there's erosion, plants may do it, and you can, in some cases, put core logs out that last about 18 months. And in that time, your plants have grown up and maybe they can handle future energy. But as soon as you start putting any structure in, then you fall out of that exemption, unfortunately. We really need to get the state. And surprisingly, the feds, right, 8 years ago, they put in the nationwide 54. They didn't have any exemptions like that before. And so you can even big agencies like the Corps, you can get them to change their rules. Now, the 54 has been very useful. I've been using it, and lately on living shorelines, we get that before we get our state permit. And so it is a useful tool, but the local rules and the state need to provide provisions for, less than 70 feet or less than whatever most homeowners' waterfront is. And if there's no essential fish habitat at all, no impacts, why can't they have some basic design that can be exempt? So it's something that I think as a group, we would love to petition to see if we can't get them. In fact, right today, I was on a call with DEP. They're putting a new exemption in for planting seagrass, right? So why can't they do one for living shorelines under the right condition? We don't want people to just do crazy stuff, but if we have certain design with no impacts, why can't that be an automatic? And so I would love it if this group and others that have connections can petition and ask for this to be investigated.
Like we got another question for Brittany Cass from Manatee County. We'll go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll move on to the next presentation.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So some of our prospective properties, we had consultants raise concerns about removing the existing seawalls or crushing the seawalls in place because of possible concrete contaminant issues depending on when the seawalls were actually built. Is that something that you've run into in your permitting or in some of your projects that you've done, or is it something that we do need to be concerned about?
And I'm not an expert in concrete or that. I know normal concrete is not pH'd correctly for salt water. Okay, so that's why when they do oyster domes, they use adjusted pH for that, and that's better for the environment. Now, to further answer your question, a lot of projects that when we take these seawalls out, what are you going to do with this material, right? In a lot of places, it's soft sediment right in front, and we don't want to put our lime rock to just sink into the mud. So we have used that old concrete that was been there for 30, 40 years, which we think doesn't have the same issue as brand new concrete. And as long as it doesn't have rebar in it, we use that as sacrificial material. We put it down, it sinks into the mud, and then we put our preferred, our design material, lime rock, over it to get to the elevation. So you can, as far as I know, I don't see big issues of using that, especially because it's kind of buried then. But yes, concrete by itself is not pH right for salt water unless somebody pours it that way.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, Kelly. All right, Carrie, do you want to go ahead and introduce?
Sure. Okay, so our next speaker is Eric Plage, and he works for Tampa Bay Watch, and he's going to be talking about some of their experiences at MacDill with some living shoreline projects there. You've got the floor, Eric.
Thank you, Carrie. Appreciate that. I'm pretty sure everybody here is probably familiar with who we are, but if not, just so everybody's aware, Tampa Bay Watch is a nonprofit dedicated to fostering a healthy Tampa Bay watershed through community-driven restoration projects, education programs, and outreach initiatives. And today I'm going to be talking about kind of our longest running project as far as living shorelines goes, which is MacDill Air Force Base. We've been creating living shorelines there since 2003. Next slide. Oop, Carrie, next slide. Can you hear me?
Hold on, technical difficulty.
Uh-oh. I mean, Tom's was flawless. I don't, what?
Hold on.
All good.
I may have to do this in non-presentation mode, so it seems to be going fine doing it that way. So I'll share it that way. Okay.
That looks good.
All right, so as I was saying, we're talking about MacDill Air Force Base today. Here's a kind of a location of where we are in the bay. Next slide. And then we're talking about specifically the 1.7 miles of living shoreline we've placed there since 2003. So the red indicates that. Most of it's located around the southeast tip there, up the eastern side there, up past the waste treatment plant and the boulevard as well. Next slide. So when we're creating these living shorelines, we generally use two different types of materials for our hard substrate. We use the oyster reef balls. We actually use the low profile reef balls. So they're 18 inches tall and weigh anywhere from about 150 to 200 pounds. And we also use the oyster shell bags with either the aquaculture mesh with either fossilized or recycled oyster shell. Next slide. And so the way we go about this is we are all community volunteer based. So with the oyster shell bags, we actually have the fossilized shell delivered to the site on the day of whichever landing site we've chosen. Usually when we're doing it by water, it's a boat ramp or a site up on the shore. Community volunteers will then shovel that shell into PVC tubes, making an aquaculture mesh bag. You switched on me. Using an aquaculture mesh bag that usually weighs about 30 to 40 pounds, like a sandbag. And then from there, next slide. And then as far as the oyster reef balls go, the low profile reef balls, again, they're made by community volunteers here on site at Tampa Baywatch in Tierra Verde. We have the fiberglass molds. It's typically a group of about 20 to 25 people that will participate in that. And before you think that everybody out there is lifting those 150 to 200 pound reef balls by themselves, there's only a few of us that nominate ourselves for that. A lot of it goes into putting the molds together, taking them apart, scooping concrete, the likes of that. But again, they're made usually about 25 to 30 at a time at our facility here. Next slide. And then when I talk about, how we're community volunteer based, really volunteers are our mission. We couldn't do any of this without them. As far as the MacDill Living Shoreline goes, we're up to probably about 12,000 to 13,000 volunteers that have helped throughout the life of that project, either on the construction side of the reef balls, the installation side of the shell bags and the reef balls and the salt marsh and all of that. So again, we are driven by our volunteers, and without them, we really couldn't accomplish anything. Next slide. So then as far as transportation goes, again, using small materials, we're using trailers, utility trailers for the oyster reef balls, either deploying them on site at site locations, and then maneuvering them on the day of. There's that tractor there. That was never my as part of the project. We've always never had heavy machinery involved in it. We had to carry them down the shoreline on our own. But on top of that boat down in the bottom right corner, that's compliments of our friends at Reef Innovations, Larry Beggs. So sometimes when we have to deploy them via water, when the landing site, or I should say the site from land, is too hard to get to with a trailer, we're either using that cat boat, or pontoon boat, I should say, or we actually using our 24-foot Carolina skiffs to deploy the oyster reef balls as well. Next slide. And then as far as installation goes, I mean, again, all these techniques are really done via volunteers with your own hands. So we have the galvanized steel bar that you can put between two of these through one of these reef balls, and then each kind of equally carry the weight down the shoreline. They roll pretty well as well. They roll very well. And then something we've been using a lot recently are actually the gorilla carts that you can get at Home Depot. Surprisingly, they've held up in the salt water pretty well. I was afraid they were going to break down very quickly, but you can put up to 2 reef balls on that, and depending on the the consistency of your shoreline, can kind of push them to where you need to go. As I said before, we also use the 24-foot Carolina skiffs when putting these shorelines together, typically for the shell bags themselves. But again, we can also use the reef balls in those as well, usually about 12 at a time, and then bring them close to the shoreline and then offload them via the fireman line with the shell bags, or again, rolling or using the bar with the reef balls. Next slide. So then the top picture shows one of these shorelines with the reef balls out. You can kind of see them just off the top there. And then the intertidal zone there, the bare intertidal zone there from a lot of high energy. And then the photo below shows kind of a tied up, but the reef balls are out there. Then you have your shell bags in there that have just kind of recently been placed there, as they don't have too much oyster recruitment at this point in the photo. We can see all that salt marsh growing in behind it, and that's complements of our Bay Grasses in Classes program and our native plantings, where school groups will actually grow that salt marsh in nurseries and bring half of those plugs out to our project sites every year as part of their field trips, plant them behind our living shorelines, and grow those coastal marshes. Next slide. So this is kind of what it looked like in 2003 and 2004 along the MacDill Air Force Base shoreline. Very high erosion. You have to remember, the biggest thing kind of facing this shoreline is not only longshore currents and tides, but also having the main shipping channel located just offshore. So every time one of those large vessels goes by, really kind of throws a wake up on this shoreline. Feels often, I'm sure many are familiar, but those who are not, feels almost like a small tidal wave. The water gets sucked out as you're standing there and then kind of surges onto the shore. So you can see all the upland plants there that are basically knocked over, washed away, your palms and things like that, that are now the first line of defense, at least at this point. Next slide. So the original project out at MacDill Air Force Base was a pilot project near the waste treatment plant. We used about, I think, 4 different techniques of oyster reef balls positioning, as well as loose shell on these 4 different kind of examples to try to test out which was the most held up the best. So, you can see from that photo, there's a liner laid down there with the reef balls on top of it. Some of them were spread 3 feet apart. Some of them were kind of created a corral around the area, and then the loose shell was placed within that. Some of them were put side by side. So 4 kind of varying different aesthetics for this pilot project, which was the original one there at MacDill. Next slide. And then throughout the years, we've come through a few more different designs. These are called the Aztec ruins. Perhaps Peter Clark can answer the reason as to why they were created such as that. But this was on that southeastern tip with those reef balls placed out front, and then those shell bags in behind, the salt marsh behind that. So this is just kind of after the reef balls were put in place, shell bags were put in place before any of the plantings occurred. Next slide. And then this is phase 4. This is kind of a little more, as far as the look goes, these are the brackets, a little more aesthetically pleasing. Granted, we're not going for aesthetics here when we're talking about trying to create these living shorelines. Next slide. And then rounding out into kind of, this was a 2022 project that happened kind of at the northern section of our living shoreline. Originally, these brackets were created to really just as just oyster shell bags. So a bracket was created, and then the idea was to hold that sediment in place and then plant that salt marsh in behind. We quickly discovered, and we've kind of quickly discovered throughout the bay, within probably about, I'd say, the last 5 or 6 years, that oyster shell bags placed on some of these shorelines by themselves do not hold up great. This high energy environment that we're kind of living in now, especially on these shorelines, and honestly throughout the entire bay, even in some low energy environments, we've noticed just an increase in energy where these shell bags used to kind of hold by themselves. We've seen them start to break up. kind of all at once, not in any sort of 10-year cycle or anything like that. So we actually went back quickly, amended our permits, and were able to place reef balls in front of these brackets in order to make sure they weren't going anywhere. Next slide. And so what I wanted to focus on, again, for kind of what this slide, or I'm sorry, this presentation in particular was talk about that McDill Phase 1 I talked about, that original pilot project. Next slide. And that is located right there on the map. So this is 2006. So a couple of years after that project had gone into place, that is one of those corralled areas of reef balls with scattered reef balls in it. The voids in there were actually loose shell. So we discovered very quickly that that loose shell was not going to stay there. Thus the reason for things like needing to bag it moving forward. But you can see that those oyster reef balls are growing oysters, and the plantings have not taken place. So you got a bare shoreline behind it. Next slide. But kind of just to fast forward quickly into, cover a bunch of years very quickly for this particular project. In 2009, with this pilot project, you can see what it looked like with the salt marsh and the shell bags and the reef balls out in front. And then you can see what it looked like in 2022 when we kind of had been revisiting it periodically. In 2015, 2016, there was some noticeable kind of damage to the salt marsh, but the bags were still there. But within the last 5 to 6 years, again, this is a 20-year-old project. Within the last 5 to 6 years, we noticed some significant declines in some of the living shoreline that had been established there as part of this pilot project. This kind of brought up the idea to us that with these small-scale materials, and I'll kind of talk about this more, but the idea that there might actually need to be some maintenance that goes on these living shorelines to hold on to what we've gained. Next slide. And again, this is some of that erosion that was taking place, those salt marshes that had done so well for 15 years. The mangroves that have grown up through those salt marshes that were holding that shoreline in place behind that protected area of those sporadic oyster reef ball fields and those shell bags, really showing the significant size of erosion from energy, not only from storms, winds, tides, but again, that waking of, Port Tampa Bay, Port Manatee, Mosaic traffic going up the shore. And again, just to cover it, during the pandemic, it seems like everybody went out and bought a boat. I think there's 120,000 registered vessels in Tampa Bay as of now. So, Tom spoke to it. Everybody's familiar with it, but really, the waking of these vessels is really contributing to these high energy environments in areas where they wouldn't necessarily be. Next slide. So as part of the McDill Phase 1 pilot project, we put together the McDill Phase 1 supplemental using our lessons learned from all the previous projects. You can see in orange, those were the original fields of oyster reef balls. And what we've done is coming behind it with the oyster reef balls. We're interlocking those reef balls 4 deep to really hold that sediment in place. We're using jute bags under all of the reef balls and under the shell bags to try to stop some of that subsidence that will occur sometimes with these heavy materials. We've also learned to use the oyster shell bags in more of a bed system than just a bar. Oftentimes when you get these high energy events and things like that, and some of this oyster culch gets knocked off of these reefs, what we've been noticing is it's actually winding up in the salt marsh. It's not settling just beside the reef balls, it's getting pushed up the shoreline. So if there is a wider bed for this oyster culch to settle on, perhaps the idea is it won't roll off of that oyster reef and away, and then we'll be coming in and planting salt marsh beyond that. Next slide. And kind of as we talk about that, and as we talk about, at least with these projects at McDill, the idea of maintenance, this is another example of what Phase 3, so this is behind the quote Aztec ruins, what it looked like in 2016. It was placed in 2005, so that's 11 years afterwards. you know, the reef balls holding all those oysters. The shell bags are still there with the oysters, and it looks like a nice marsh. And in 2022, what we're starting to notice on some of the fringes is the salt marsh. Again, it seems to me that what we're experiencing, especially with the salt marsh in this instance, is that a lot of that mulch that comes off those reefs is being trapped by that salt marsh, and actually the upland, or I should say the salt marsh, is actually rising or elevating faster than the oyster reefs can. And perhaps that is why when these waves are coming on shore, they're kind of starting to impact those fringes of that salt marsh. And as far as we're talking about with these maintenance projects, you know, we want to retain what we have there. We want to be proactive and not reactive. We've, you know, accreted sediment behind these shell bags, behind these reef balls, and raised the shoreline. So in our minds, it makes sense to then come in with another, I would say smaller set, but still set of reef balls or set of shell bags to stabilize what has been gained. Next slide. And then kind of the last thing I'll say is this is, you know, this is an interesting slide because my kind of first interaction with Tampa Baywatch as a volunteer or part-time person kind of took place in 2010 on MacDill Phase 4. And this is MacDill Phase 4, as I mentioned. The top picture shows what MacDill Phase 4 looked like in 2016. There was always this kind of edge of reef balls that kind of went up, kind of to the high water, the mean high water line and beyond, to kind of just anchor that corner of the project. And the idea being that those reef balls really weren't contributing any sort of biological filtration or oyster communities because they were above kind of that water line where those oysters would grow. And over the course of 2016 to 2022, you'll notice that those conditions have changed. Granted, this isn't necessarily that the water has come up that far. There is probably some subsidence, maybe some undercutting, but it's kind of a quite the contrast to see what they looked like 6 years ago and then what they look like now as far as how far those oysters have migrated up that edge. So I always like to incorporate that in there. Next slide. And then here are our funders and supporters as part of the MacDill Air Force Base Living Shoreline. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Eric. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question if you can hear me.
Yep.
So Eric, great presentation. It was good that you mentioned partners because none of these projects are done by themselves, right? It really takes a collaborative to get them done. But my question is, you know, some of the observations you're making, do you think if you had to, or if you could you put larger oyster domes out there to, you know, accommodate sea level rise, or do you think it would have mattered if these were a little bit higher structures?
So I think, I guess to answer that question of what I've heard potentially might be going on in some of these situations, talking about longshore, I mean, maybe this is not the question you're asking, so I apologize, but there's been talk of, you know, longshore bars off of some of these areas potentially to really slow some of that energy from ever arriving at the shoreline. And then the hope being that behind that kind of behind those longshore bars, with that energy dissipated, we'd be able to focus more with these smaller scale materials on creating more beds and less of a, you know, a wall or an arm, you know, a shoreline set up to try to defend against that energy. As far as bigger reef balls on the shorelines themselves, I mean, certainly there's talk of using bigger materials in these projects. The only concern we have is, you know, the only concern we deal with here as Tampa Baywatch is, you know, everything is community volunteer based. You know, we're talking about 150 to 200 pound oyster reef balls as is. And we really love to try to incorporate the community as much as we can in these. Certainly, you know, there's discussion to be had about, you know, interlacing larger materials with smaller materials in some of these situations and still involving the community. but I don't know if I personally by myself can lift any of those bigger ones, those bigger reef balls. I know I can lift the smaller ones, but I'm only one guy. That said, we are looking to the future to try to adjust some of these ideas and practices as sea level keeps coming up and those energy situations just keep ramping up. Does that
Thanks,
answer your
Eric.
question?
That did answer the question, and I appreciate that, and I understand that. And I just wanted to have, I guess, a comment is that, we were doing some work looking at the study that was done on ship wakes in Tampa Bay, and we were looking at trying to protect Swiftmont's property at Apollo Beach. And the shocking thing to me is that in a 1 year, normal shipping wakes in this area, right where you are, but on the other side, the energy that comes to the shore in 365 days is equivalent to a Cat 1 hurricane. And so there is a lot more energy there just from ship wakes. Never mind that's compounded if you happen to have big east winds and storms, et cetera, and elevated waters. But I'm just saying that it's really energy. I was so surprised the coastal engineer was able to calculate that, but that just shows you these ships really do have an impact. And so maybe it's going to have to be either, like you said, some futuristic where we could have some real underwater breakwaters or barrier islands out there in front, or you're going to have heavier material to handle those ship wakes. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents with not being an engineer. Thanks again for your years of work out there.
Looks like there's one more question in the chat here. Eric, do you think the loss of vegetation behind the oyster balls after the initial gain could be due to a change in elevation as well, probably bringing the marsh grass out of its habitable zone?
Um, Potentially. It's I don't know that we've seen it thin just on its own. Typically, when we're losing it, it's based. You can see the exposed roots, you can see the impacts as far as erosionally and things like that. So the migration or losing that sediment, that proper elevation, I don't think plays as big a factor, but certainly could be a possibility.
Hi, Eric. Jamie Swindes here. I had a question. You brought up a couple of different shapes, designs. You talked about 4 reef balls deep, some spacing. Do you feel that now with the different variations that you guys have done, is there one type of design that seems to be most successful?
Yeah, so I think, as far as what we do through our living shorelines, we've established that when we have enough space throughout that intertidal zone, the 4 reef balls, the set of 4 reef balls deep interlocking really slows down the most amount of energy coming to the shore, and holds that sediment in place, provides that landing zone for all those spat oysters. That said, moving forward, I think our focus, or what I'm trying to push for, is more, or I shouldn't say push for, more as ideas is more kind of circular beds, trying to mimic more the natural oyster beds, whether that be with our shell bags in the middle and then with oyster reef balls surrounding it. Really just kind of trying to up not only our acreage of oysters through creating kind of a pad with reef balls surrounding it, but also helping with stability as well, kind of a self-contained and having a landing place for that culch. So the 4 reef balls is our best bet as far as what we produce holding our shoreline together, with the shell bags behind it in beds. But moving
Okay,
forward, we're also focusing on trying to create beds with oyster reef balls surrounding the shell bags.
excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, our next speaker is Steve Myers, and there's been a lot of talk about wave energy affecting living shoreline. So I think his talk is going to be really pertinent on some of the discussions. I'll go ahead and let him take the reins. Thank you for being with us, Steve.
Hi, Carrie. Thanks for the invitation to speak here. Can everyone see this?
It looks like it just switched to your agenda. If you could just bring yeah, there you go.
Okay. So, hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Myers. I'm a research scientist at the USF College of Marine Science. Today, I'm going to present some results from a study we did monitoring wave activity near Felipe Park. This, of course, ties into the planned installment of living shorelines in that area. There's a number of people who've been involved in this study in various ways, various times. Lyndon Cheek, Laura Azevedo, Mauricio Arias, Megan Kramer, Mark Luther, Ed Sherwood, Marcus Beck, Stacy Day, Robert Burns, Ali Riemann, and Zach Westfall. So I think most people here are familiar with the planned installation near Felipe Park. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the location from our perspective as physical oceanographers. And then I'll talk a little bit about the objectives of this study and the technology that we used to record and monitor the wave environment there. And our analysis, I'll present the results of our analysis. Now, this is going to be something of a technical presentation, but I want to, provide some understanding of the methods and the means by which we came to the conclusions that we did. Right, so, of course, Felipe Park is in the northwest part of Old Tampa Bay. It's relatively sheltered. That is, that there's limited wind fetch. That is, the open water is relatively short, over which the wind can pick up and drive a large wave activity. So, of course, to the north there's the land, and to the south there's the Courtney Campbell, which has a gap in it, but it still provides a lot of barrier to wave propagation. So we expect this to be relatively low wave energy compared to, say, the middle of the bay or out in the Gulf. So this first picture at the top, that's the seawall, corner of the seawall looking kind of in the southwest direction towards the Indian Mound. And this picture was taken at relatively low tide. You can see that the shoreline is exposed at this time. And then this lower picture is taken further up towards the north of the of the seawall, and you can see this is relatively high tide, and the water is reaching the seawall. So that's important for understanding the results that we get later. This is a picture I took looking up the seawall, looking roughly towards the north. A few minutes before I took this, a boat had passed coming in from the north towards the south. And so when boats pass, they throw off a wake, which is a wave packet that consists of multiple wave crests. And you can see them coming in. I don't know if this thing has a pointer or if you can see my cursor. No?
We can't see your cursor.
All right. All right. Well, against the seawall towards the lower left, you can see one of the crests crashing. And then if you move a little bit to the right, you can see angling off of the seawall is a line. That's another of the crests from the wave packet, from the boat wake. And then there's another one if you go further out. And there's a couple others you can see. And if you look further down towards the north, you might be able to make out, oh wait, hold on, I think this is the pointer here. Can you see that? So then you can, if you look up further north, you'll see these crest lines here, which are oriented differently. And these are reflected wakes. All right, so as the boat came in from the north. It arrived, the wake arrived at the seawall to the north earlier, bounced off, and that's what we're seeing there. So this is a interesting and dynamic area to look at waves. And there's a lot that's really unknown. And this kind of goes to the question that Tom raises, how do we know that the living shorelines are doing anything? So this is one approach. So we want to look at, what are the wave amplitudes? What are their frequencies? What direction are they moving? What's generating them? Are they wind driven, or are they just coming off the boats? And in this case, how often are they reflecting off the seawall? So the idea here is to kind of do a before and after study. So this is the before, phase 1. And then the afterward, hopefully we'll be able to do it after the living shorelines are installed. So to that end, we installed a wave gauge, which I'll describe in a moment, down here near the Indian Mound. And you see that in general, the water depth in that area is about 2 or 3 feet. And in the central part of the bay, it's the harbor, it's considerably deeper, 7, 9, 10, even 16 feet deep. So this is the wave gauge array that we used. It's a custom design that was built by Mark Luther and the engineers at RBR. And it consists of 4 high-frequency pressure sensors that are synchronized and their output recorded by a data logger. So with the pressure data, we can then convert that to depth. And we want to use an array because by looking at the lag between the different sensors, then we can construct the wave direction. So below is a typical time series of water depth that we got from one of the sensors. Now, I'll get to the details of that in a second. The wave gauge was deployed 60 meters or so off the seawall. You can see the seawall here in this aerial view. And getting ahead of myself a little bit, these 2 green lines, they demarcate the limits of what we consider to be the range of angles from which we're getting a lot of reflection off the seawall, a lot of wave energy coming off the seawall. And one thing, kind of a detail, but an important one, is that when you're looking at boat wakes, you have to, you should make sure to understand, take into account that the angle that which the boat wakes propagate, it does not go in the same direction as the boat itself. It actually comes off at about a 35-degree angle from the travel line. So that's something you take into account when you're looking at wake direction and associating that with a boat passage. So it took us a while to get this custom design working, but we had 3 successful deployments of the array in 2020. The first one was just a single sensor, and then the subsequent 2 was the full array with all 4 sensors, and these were increasingly lengthy in duration, the last one being about a month. We also did a validation test where Stacy and Allie took the 17-foot boat and made multiple passes at various distances and various speeds in the vicinity of the gauge. So we're able to correlate the signal that we recorded with the boat passage. So this is recording from the 4 sensors during the final deployment. And see, it's dominated by the tides. It's diurnal and semi-diurnal signals, but this isn't what we're interested in. We're interested in the wave signals. So we use high-pass filtering because wave signals are much higher frequency than the 12 and 24-hour tides. So this is our wave signals from the 4 sensors. And first thing is that the amplitude is much smaller. These are relatively weak waves. Tidal signals plus or minus half a meter. These are nominally plus or minus 5 centimeters. But there's a lot of detail in here. So if we zoom in, kind of these 2 indicated time periods, we get 2 very different types of signals. One which we attributed to wind waves, the other to boat wakes. So in the case of the wind waves, you're seeing fairly fixed frequency, right, at 1 to 2 seconds or so, but the amplitude is getting modulated. And in the second case, you're seeing a changing frequency where it's a little bit slower, and then it gets faster and faster and faster. And that's a classic boat wake signal. So before I get into all the directional and advanced analysis, first thing we did was ran some basic statistics off the data from each of the sensors. And this is looking at wave amplitudes. So this is like the mean value to the peak. A lot of times engineers will look at wave height, which is peak to trough, in which case you just multiply these numbers by 2. We looked at average wave amplitude, maximum wave amplitude, significant wave amplitude, and the latter is a measure that was developed actually around World War II, and it's widely used in civil and coastal engineering as well as maritime design. Sorry. Yeah, so the average wave amplitudes in all sensors were between 5 and 5.5 millimeters. And the significant wave amplitudes were around between 9 and 10 millimeters. So that's what I would consider a weak environment. All right. So direction, wave direction, how do we get that? Well, we use something with it called the directional wave spectrum. And this is based on the lags between the 4 different sensors. So the way to interpret this is, so here's your gauge in the middle, and then you have your directions going around it. And then the radius, though, this is the frequency. So this innermost circle corresponds to periods of 10 seconds. The outermost circle is 1 second. Right, so and the colors are intensity. So this is averaged over the entire time of that last deployment. So we're seeing a lot of wave energy coming from the northeast, as well as from the southwest, and then moderately from the east as well. So when you're dealing with power spectra, they're very nice to work with because you can chop them up, you can partition them, integrate over them. And in this case, first thing we did was that we looked at, remember those earlier green lines that I showed you? Here they are. This zone here is what we call, this is our reflecting zone, and the rest would be the incoming energy. So we can look at that and integrate over these regions. And we do this not over the entire set, but actually every hour. All right. So that's what this top plot is the blue line is all the incoming energy every hour, and the brown line is the reflected energy. You can see just visually that the incoming energy is always larger. And if we look at the ratio of these two, right, your eye can probably pick out this kind of soft ceiling there, right, around 0.4, where we're looking, sorry, this is the reflectivity ratio, the ratio of the reflected energy versus the incoming energy, right? And as you can see, with a few exceptions, the values are around 0.4 or less. So we can quantify that a little bit better. We can create a distribution. Look at here in blue, this histogram. You can see there's a strong peak at 0.4. And we look at the cumulative distribution. The values at 0.4 and below represent about 80% of the cases that we sampled. So this means that roughly 60% of the wave, or 40% of the wave energy is being reflected, or at least is being detected by the gauge. So there's another approach to looking at that. This has to do with the tidal phase. Remember, I showed that the shoreline gets exposed during low tide, so you don't anticipate good reflection there in that case. So on the right, this is the scatter plot of our reflection coefficient versus the relative depth, which is just normalized water depth from 0 being the lowest and 1 being the highest water depth we recorded. So for low water depth, we're getting just this wide scatter of low reflectivity. But at higher water depth, we're getting this concentration around the 0.4 value. All right, so this means that you're getting a lot more reflection off of the seawall at the higher water depths, right, which makes intuitive sense. All right, so that gives you a flavor of the kinds of things that we can do with directional spectra. Now I'll talk about a different aspect of the study, which is where we're separating out the boat wakes from the wind waves. Now, to do that, we used wavelet analysis. This is a technique that's been increasingly popular in the study of boat wakes in the last few years. And so we have at the top figure here is our wave signal taken from one of our instruments. And the bottom is the wavelet decomposition. So let me show you what that is. So the horizontal axis is time, and the vertical axis is frequency, where the bottom is 10 seconds and the top is 1 second. And then you can see a couple features here. You can see these arcing features, and you can see this keyboard-like feature. So these arcs, this means that you're going from a low frequency to high frequency, which is what we saw earlier as a boat wake. So these are what boat wakes look like in this decomposition. And then this keyboard is the winds. So it's relatively fixed frequency with just modulated amplitude. So this is useful because we can identify the boat wakes very easily. All right, we can count their position. We can count their occurrence. We can see how long they exist, and then we can also look at their energy, the total energy of the wakes compared to the total energy of the winds. So counting. So this top figure is our wave signal during the validation test when we were doing the boat passes, and below is the wavelet analysis, the wavelet amplitude. So again, the horizontal axis is time, vertical axis is frequency, and we can see these arcing features in here. And the dashed line is when our objective technique, which we developed for this, identified wakes. And we had to use that because we had to develop something like that because the wakes only last a few minutes, and we have a month of data. So it's not really practical to go through manually and search for these. So we're able to find these wakes, see when they occur, look at their relative amplitudes, things like that. You can see in the upper plot that we're still talking just a few centimeters, plus or minus a few centimeters. We also look at when they occur. So they occur mostly between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m., which is when recreational boating activity occurs. We also can look at the wakes, or the energy of these wakes, and sum it up and compare to the whole time series. And we find that the wakes are about 10% of the total energy, even though they only occur about 4% of the time. And now this question of the reflection data, how much wave energy is impacting the seawall? And when does it occur? Well, we look at this relative water depth during the times that we've identified the wakes, but we also have to identify the reflection. The reflected wakes, of course, are double, right? There's 2 wakes coming through. You get the incoming wake, and then you get the reflected wake. And that's why some of these have these double structures that you can see here. Instead of a single arc, you get these double arcs. And we're confident those are reflections. I'll show you that in just a moment, why we think that is. But then we looked at the reflection relative at the times of the water depth, the relative water depth. We only found reflected wakes at higher water levels. Again, makes perfect intuitive sense, but it's now verified and quantified. All right, so this is my last fancy slide. How do we know that these are reflected wakes? Well, here's one of our boat passes. Here's the signal at the top. This is one of our boat passes. And this is the wavelet decomposition down here. So again, horizontal axis is time, vertical axis is frequency, right? And how do we know it's not two wakes or something else going on? Well, we go back and we apply our directional wave spectrum, right? So first we do it over this first minute of the signal, of the data. And we see that in the directional wave spectra that there's a signal coming in from the northeast, which makes perfect sense once we traced out the path of the boat, accounted for the angle of propagation of the wake. That's exactly where we expect to see that wake coming from. And then we looked at the entire signal, and we see that there's an additional source coming from the south. And again, if we look at the propagation of the signal and it reflecting off the seawall, this is where we expect to see the reflection coming from. And there's no other boats in the area at this time. The weather's calm. So this is how we determined, or we confirmed that this double structure was in fact a reflected signal. All right, so to summarize, we've confirmed that Felipe Park is a low wave energy region, low compared to, say, the middle of the bay or the Gulf. That both wind-driven waves and boat-driven waves are important and contribute significantly to the wave environment. See, most of the wave energy is from the north, but there's a lot coming off the seawall. The wakes are only present about 4% of the time, but they contain 10% of the total wave energy. And of course, the reflections only occur when the water level is relatively high, when we have a high tide. And so we are ready, we think we're ready for our the next phase of this project. And we'll be standing by, just let us know. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Does anybody have any questions?
Hey, Steve, this is Tom Reese. First of all, really excellent presentation. That was extremely technical and understandable. So I like it. But I just have one question to make sure I understand this. So when you're saying during high tide in this location, the second half of the wake signal, in other words, a refracted wave, isn't it only 40%? Did you say it was 40% of the original energy?
Yes, it seems to be maxing out around 40%. I think a lot of that loss is due to the breaking of the wave.
Okay, and so when you're taking it, when you say there's 10% of the energy is due to boat wakes, does that include the refracted wave?
No, yeah, it includes all the waves, yes.
Okay.
So you have, right, it's just because the wakes are relatively rare. So in total, you know, they are, in total, they're relatively weak, but although their amplitudes are generally higher. So that's why they over included, why they're, even though they only exist for 4% of the time, they represent 10% of the energy.
Okay, thank you again.
All right, any other questions? I don't think I see anything in the chat. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your presentation. Next, we'll have Stacy Day. She's going to provide us an update on her living shoreline project at Philippi Park. I don't see
Stacey,
you,
would you like me
Stacy.
to bring your slides up, or do you want to share your screen?
I can share my screen. That's fine.
Okay. Let me
Let me
make you
see.
presenter.
Let's see if we can do this successfully.
Yeah, just hold on a second. Let me make you
Okay.
presenter.
Cool.
And this is really pertinent because you'll be talking about the same living shoreline. All right, let's see. Find you on here. Would you mind turning on your camera real quick so that I can find you?
There we are.
Oh, there you are. Okay, gotcha. Thank you. All right, making you presenter.
Great.
We've got a
And I
really
could,
full room today, so it's great.
awesome. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Can you see my screen?
We can,
Yes.
thank you.
All right. Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about, we've done several phases out at Philippi Park. So the southern half of the shoreline is natural. It's got mangroves and oysters and, no hardened seawall. The northern half of the park is a seawall, which is the area that Steve was just talking about. So over the past almost 2 years now, it's hard to believe, we've been installing some additional living shoreline elements, some oyster bags and some marsh grass plantings, and an oyster reef is what we've just completed just, a few weeks ago. And then we're hoping, we have some funding from TBERP to start putting stuff in front of the seawall. So it's all related to the park, but it's actually multiple phases. So as Steve said, hopefully once we start getting some enhancements along the seawall, then we're going to be putting that wave energy monitoring equipment back out. And hopefully we'll see lower reflection, lower energy bouncing off of our living shoreline elements versus the hardened seawall. So, okay, but today I'm just going to focus on the oyster reef phase. And basically, this was designed as part of a living shoreline, probably about 3 phases. So, starting back in October, we put some oyster bags along the shoreline at the south end of the park, and we helped kind of direct kayakers, basically. So the park staff told us that there's a lot of people that launch kayaks just kind of through the mangroves, and they were concerned about some of the mangrove areas getting damaged because people were just kind of picking a spot that looked like they could cut through. So with our oyster bags, we tried to kind of guide the traffic. So now there's some very defined openings. And we also put some marsh grasses. So you can see the marsh grasses have done great. These bags are now starting to grow some oysters. And then kind of one of the final phases of this project was to install an oyster reef. And it's really, we called it an oyster bar, but the public was getting kind of confused. They thought we were talking about like a come out and drink bar. So we're referring to it as a reef to make everyone very clear that this is not, a hangout spot necessarily. It's a reef to protect our shoreline. So anyway, as designed, we were going to create a ring of oyster bag and then fill the ring with loose oyster shell so that over time, there's a lot of hard substrate out there and the oysters will recruit and we'll have a nice happy oyster reef out there. And this is designed about 300 linear feet and then about 60 feet wide. And it's placed about 300 feet off the shore. So our first step was to create these oyster bags. And so we did that last summer. We got 17 tons of fossilized shell from a clam farmer in Cedar Key. And we created about 1,800 shell bags using volunteers. We had about 50 volunteers come out over a number of Saturday mornings. It took us about 20 hours of those people. So they're awesome, super hot. And so then last summer, we installed those bags out in the water over 4 evenings. We kept getting chased off the water with thunderstorms. We needed a low tide so we could see how to place these things. And of course, last summer, all the low tides were in the evening and all the thunderstorms were also. So it was a little bit frustrating, but we did finally get it installed in October, finished. And the way that we did this was to create a pyramid. So it was 3 oyster bags on the bottom, 2 on top. And we basically just made kind of like, think about like a racetrack, you know, so it just kind of looped around, making that, that circle, that oval. We had about 300 volunteers participate over those evenings, almost 1,000 hours of volunteer service. And this is what it looked like when we got done. You can see this is again at a lower tide. At higher tide, you can't see this at all. But this is what it looks like. We saw birds starting to forage out there pretty immediately. And you can see just from our PVC pipes here, we did get barnacles and, you know, a lot of growth on those subsurfaces. This is what it looks like from aerial. It's kind of cool because we were able to do pretty good on our placement. You know, we had ESA, Brian Flynn and Tom met us out there with like some surveying equipment. So we kind of placed some PVCs as a guide, and then, you know, we did what we could, and I think we did pretty good. I was really happy to see this aerial. So again, we're at the very south shore of the park. So up here in this image to the left, the red is the whole park. Okay, so we've done a little bit of monitoring. The tides are really working against us. We've had really high tide during daylight hours, but we were able to get pretty good amount of monitoring done in March. So about 7 months after we had installed those bags, we had a lot of oysters growing out there. So very exciting. And we're actually going to go out this afternoon and tomorrow and do some more monitoring. So hopefully we have even bigger, happier oysters. So this summer, we bought 32 tons of loose recycled oyster shell from Tampa Baywatch. And over 3 mornings, we installed with about 260 volunteers. And I have to give props to Damon Moore with Oyster River Ecology. He allowed us to use these floating docks and these crates, and it worked awesome. So we basically just had a line of people, you know, people shoveling and putting the shell in the crates. We put it on these floating docks and, you know, took it out to the water and dumped it into the ring. So it worked great. We are hoping to maybe get 1 more load of shell. We've probably filled about 70% of the circle with those 32 tons. You know, we didn't get complete coverage. We were working at high tide this time just to make it easier to get the shell out there. So, you know, we didn't get complete coverage, but we have a lot of surface out there that the oysters should be able to, you know, latch onto and start growing. And that's where we're at. And thanks everybody for coming out to help, because I know quite a few people on the call did come out and participate at some point. So thank you.
Thanks, Stacy. That's great. Does anybody have any questions for Stacy? All right. We have 1 more planned Living Shoreline uplift date from Erica Moulton from St. Pete. Oh, hold on. We have 1 question from Eric. Do you want to go ahead and turn on your mic and ask it?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the presentation. That's an interesting project. I was curious if the monitoring showed any oyster recruitment on the loose shell that had been scattered in the middle there, and not just the actual shell bags themselves.
Yeah, so not yet. I mean, it's only been like a month. So
oh, the loose, okay.
Yeah, the loose shell's only been a month. So they're definitely recruiting onto the bags, the ring that's been there for a while. So I'm hoping, you know, I think from what I've been told, it'll take at least 6 months before we can visibly see, you know, the baby oysters. So I'll report back in a few months.
Okay, great, thanks. Sorry, I missed it. That was more recent. Okay, thank you.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
All right. Okay, 1 more question. Stacy. Oh, a few more questions. Hold on. Let's see. From Tom, Stacy, you also placed a bedding stone base, correct?
We did. So we got some from a landscaping company. We got 12 tons of, it was called medium size recycled, or not recycled, mined shell, I guess fossilized shell. And we did place that out there. We didn't get great coverage. We definitely had like splotches of that, and you could feel it. We did that several months ago, but it was really just a little bit of, like you had said, Tom, sacrificial material, just so that we didn't use our good recycled shell. We didn't lose that into some of the deeper sediment. So we found some softer spots and put that bedding material first. We'll see how it does.
Then you had a couple more comments. Peter Clark said, please be sure to get some drone background photos.
Okay.
And Martha asked, with the stone base, is that how the loose shell remained in place?
It's just that ring. Yeah. So, it's about 2 feet tall. So, well, we'll see how well it stays in place. Hopefully we're not going to get any huge storms, but the idea is, having that edge all the way around that's, about 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall. The loose shell should stay within the ring, even if it moves a little bit. And then hopefully we'll get those oysters on there and they'll cement everything in place. Again, to be continued.
Stacey, I have a quick question. The wave study, gosh, I'm losing my words today. The wave study that was just talked about by USF, is that essentially going to be reproduced with the newer T-berth sections where
Yes.
some of the seawall accentuation is going into place with the new T-berth
Yes.
project?
Yep, that was all just baseline kind of background. How big are the waves? How much reflections coming off that hardened seawall? So yeah, then we'll repeat once we get the living shoreline element. And we're going to be doing that in phases also. So we're trying 5 different treatments. So we'll be able to see, we can compare the treatments as well as how do they compare to just the bare seawall.
Cool, thank you.
Right. Thanks for all your questions. We have one more scheduled update from Erica Moulton from St. Pete College, talking about their living shoreline installation at the STEM Center. Go ahead,
Good. You
Erica.
can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm Erica Moulton. I'm the director of St. Petersburg College's STEM Center. For those of you who aren't familiar, we're the newest campus in the SPC system. We are located right next door to Madeira Beach K-8 school and just down the street from the VA Memorial Park and Hospital. We are a 50-acre campus that only contains a single building. So we have classrooms, labs, and meeting space. So keep that meeting space in mind if you've ever liked to have a meeting. Oh, let's see. I cannot get, there we go. Okay, so our Living Shoreline project focused on the area of the lagoon known as Hurricane Hole. So that image of 2005 to 2011, that's the one most people are familiar with. They just drive over the overpass on Highway 666. And we're always used to seeing derelict vessels, but between 05 and 11, before the college built the building, there were numerous, probably close to 100 vessels in there. And so with city funding, state funding, and some other funding, those vessels slowly disappeared. The college built the campus. It was open in 2017. And then in 2021, we really took on the whole process of creating a living shoreline out of Hurricane Hole. And we were stuck with just 2 vessels, 1 dock, and some old poles from a previous dock. So if you're familiar with the area, there used to be some houses here in like the 50s, and then Pinellas County Schools had some portable classrooms here. So it's completely a new place now. Let's see. Okay, so we went into the idea of having a living shoreline with applying for the T-berth grant. And there was a lot of permitting, and as we were all talking about, that moves kind of slow. Our dean kind of refers to it as molasses on an iceberg slow within the college. So anyways, he came up with this grand plan with Tom and ESA and his partners for a complete habitat restoration encompassing most of the shoreline around the campus where students and people can access the water. But of course, once we got funding, it kind of looked more like this, right? So what can we actually tackle with the funds that we have and the timeline that we have? So we settled on removing 2 sections of seawall, taking out Brazilian pepper and other invasives in the red marked area, directly behind the building, installing some oyster bag pyramids, removing the derelict vessels, and adding a dock. So we have this better human interface with the students to be able to access the water in the living shoreline. So permitting was happening, and we just decided to dive right in because we knew that between the state process and all the other construction permitting processes and the college's blessing, it would take a little while. So we dove right in with community education. So we had astronauts come out and talk. We partnered with Audubon and their teacher camps. We offered some cleanups for students. And then we established a pretty big partnership with Cape Pinellas Beautiful and the estuary program, letting them know we were working on this project and that we would need volunteers throughout the next 2-year period. And then individually, we targeted the college community. So we went out to student groups, fraternities and sororities, environmental clubs, our construction engineering students. And then we marked the calendar really quickly for all the service days, things like MLK Day of Service, teacher training, Night with Science, a BASIS conference, planning that any of those dates that occurred during our 2-year funding, that we would focus on living shoreline and making sure that either those service dates or those teaching opportunities incorporated our living shoreline and what was going on. So remember these construction pictures under the building here. And then we engaged with the Tampa Bay communities. So we targeted the Chamber of Commerce and the leadership classes of 2021 and 2022. We offered Leadership St. Pete the opportunity to take on the STEM Center as one of their sites for learning. So we taught a lot of folks about mangroves and estuaries, business leaders and community members, so that they had some familiarity with the term living shoreline and estuary and mangroves and how important they are in this community as they finish their leadership class. I think most folks are familiar with LSP and that program. The Chamber of Commerce offers it to business leaders, and they pick about 50 candidates a year, teach them about leadership and then all the activities in the community. So we're really focused on engaging 2 years worth of participants. We had them do everything from raising baby mangroves in a solo cup to planting and digging. The Florida Bar offered Stetson Law School environmental students the opportunity to come here and learn about living shorelines. Most of them were unable to participate in standard things they would have because we had COVID. So we engaged them here, doing a portion of their environmental studies programming so they could have an in-field site. And we used the STEM Center and what we were doing for that. We engaged with tabling at the St. Petersburg Science Festival and taught the general public about living shorelines. And then we engaged with the environmental students at the IB High School, targeting them as the folks who would be the leadership for installing our oyster bags. And then we focused on all the other community partners. So that construction one, that other picture, I talked with Sheila quite a few times, and we did a give a day because every time a storm happens or a super high tide or a no-name storm, for some reason, the little peninsula that juts out with tides and currents, we end up with wood. So if you're ever looking to build something for outdoors, we've had days where we've had folks haul as much as 3,600 pounds of lumber out of here. So I know people get straws and cups, but I get lumber. So those construction engineering students came with saws and equipment, and if you hauled out lumber, we gave you a lesson on how to build things like a planter box, an Adirondack chair, whatever you wanted. And then we engaged with the Tampa Bay Rays team and a bunch of other organizations, and I'll show you some of that. So you can see where our building is and then the distance down to that temporary stockpile. So we worked to get everything down to that living shoreline. And so sometimes some of our groups where one session was just moving it to the actual place, and then another activity was actually, installing. So we would have one group bring the oyster bags from the building down to the site. We would do the give a days in between where people hauled out all this wood and lumber that washed up. I'm not kidding. The Tampa Bay Rays, their employee community outreach team, Sheila and Cape Pinellas Beautiful connected me with them. They hauled out 2 vessels in addition to planting. So we had derelict vessels that didn't fall into the category of being needed to be removed by funding. So they brought out chainsaws and cut up these little dinghies that were overturned and a Zodiac and dragged them out for me. We partnered with FWC to pull Spartina. The blue barrels are City of Oldsmar leftover oysters. The bagged oysters came from the other coast. We paid attention to other people working on projects and where they were in their timeline, and if they were finished, asking for leftovers. We have Florida Aquarium came out. They did a lot of raising mangroves and other grasses and plants, cactus with their students and interns during the summer, and then they had them come plant here. And then we finally got to this place where we had done lots of work with volunteers in the community and education. And then our contracted events were basically the derelict vessel removal. In the beginning, I kind of referred to that hurricane hole. Well, it turns out that in the deed, the college owns the submerged land rights to that property. So unfortunately, in all of the derelict vessel removal, we found out if those boats touch the bottom, they're our problem. So we went through a lot of paperwork, but we did end up having to use some funding to get the last 3 sailboats out and the floating dock. We did a pepper pool partnership where we engaged with Tom Rees and some of his contractors and a give a day and pulled Brazilian pepper, and then all the mulch went into our paths here, which has been great, and it's still in existence. It's been really nice. We also paid for the dock and deck installation and the removal of all that seawall. So this is what the derelict vessel process looked like. Removal was pretty arduous and involved the standard float stuff that happens, but then we had one of the boats in that far right picture you can see actually collapsed. So then we had to have a cleanup day to get all of that material out. So basically 2,600 volunteer hours from 473 people representing 10 organizations. So the top left there is the seawall is still in, and then the seawall is out. This is some old sidewalk that went to an old dock in the top right from when the houses were here, and the Tampa Bay Rays ECOT team, those are the guys who maintain the field for the baseball team, came back out with sledgehammers and jackhammers and pulled out all of that chain link fence and sidewalk for me at no cost. The bottom left, FWC was pulling with state funding derelict vessels from the outside of my lagoon area. I had this large vessel that I could not pull, but they had remembered that we had contacted them, and they had room on their barge that day, so they hauled it away for free. So, and then that's the bottom right there is now my seawall is out, and the lovely high tide is coming over the wall, and it's been really great. So what are we doing now? The shoreline is alive out there. We have students out all the time. We have the dock and deck in place. We have the kayak launch in place. We have students out there all the time. This is what it looked like just yesterday. So we left some of the old pilings along with the oyster bags. They look great out there. So what are we doing now? Let's follow up. So we engaged immediately with the company called Ambient Weather, and they have these amazing weather stations. So we've installed 2 of them here. So we're monitoring weather at the building and then weather out there in the habitat. We engaged with some students to do the Mangrove Detectives project, and they became very proficient with the microscope and cameras. And so now they've been logging and cataloging all the little critters that live in the mangroves, and are part of the database now. Our students' film work is part of photographs are part of the film work at Mangrove Detectives, which I know the estuary program is involved in. We established ourselves as an FWC volunteer sampling site for red tide and harmful algal blooms this summer. We had 6 students participate in that. And then now we've been monitoring birds and wildlife. And because of all of our habitat restoration, we originally were a recipient site for FWC wave gopher tortoises with a permit to take in 10. But our increase in habitat, they upped our permit to 15. So we've taken in our 11th tortoise. I'm very excited to announce Dylan Fay there has now been accepted into a program at UF, the student who's holding the tortoises, and he's working on that. But we're now seeing burrowing owls in our habitat, a lot of juvenile species of night herons, and we've come up with some really cool flagging systems for notifying all of our students what's out there and in the habitat. And that was the fastest I talked about my living shoreline. That was 2 years of work. And so, any questions?
That was wonderful. Thank you, Erica. Does anybody have any questions for Erica?
So I would like to say for sure that, you know, these meetings and the sessions about oysters and habitats and all that, they're so valuable because listening in and getting hints about who's doing what and what's left over. And I do know that, you know, we had some leftover rock and some leftover oyster, and then Tom came and got it for another project he's working on. So we were able to give back to the community just as much as we had, you know, taken in what we thought we needed. So it's been really great to have these meetings and listen to what everybody's doing. So I appreciate you guys hosting that.
That's
Well, you're
good to
very
know.
welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah, and Jeff Biradelli from Channel 8, he fancies himself the climate weatherman. You know, he came out and gave talks to our students in the Night with Science, and he's all about the living shoreline, was very fascinated by the project here. He's talked to our students a couple of times, so it's been a really great win, especially the post installation has been really great. The access for people and wildlife has been phenomenal. The number of dolphins and manatees this summer, et cetera, has been really great. Fish, crabs.
So it looks like we've got a comment from Jessica. Why don't you go ahead and just say that verbally?
Yeah, so a couple of projects here that are really awesome TBERF funded projects. So I just wanted to throw it out there that TBERF RFP opens in January. If you have questions about that, let me know. But Erica, I appreciate your work. That's a really great presentation. Stacy as well. Thank you.
And also the Bay mini grants are open right now. So if anybody has interest in those.
Yeah, the Bay Mini grants, I was going to throw it at the end, but I'll go ahead and give you some info. It's up to $5,000. They're community-based grants. They're not super appropriate for many of you because they're not really geared towards government entities, but nonprofits that you might work with, schools, universities, neighborhood associations, anything like that. Even businesses are eligible to do some of the smaller scale restoration, some of the stuff that we've seen here. As well as environmental education. So we actually have a webinar this afternoon. If you're really interested, you can come to that at 5:30.
Do you want to throw the link in the chat for folks?
I think Marcus just did for me. If you go to that link,
Perfect.
you'll
I see
see
that.
the webinar registration, and we are recording it, so you can share that recording with any nonprofits that you might work with or schools, whatever, afterward too.
Fantastic.
So we've got a few more minutes if folks want to have any additional discussions on living shorelines. I think this is a really great slate of presenters that talked about a lot of different topics related to living shorelines and how to support and do them right. So if there's any discussion related to that, go ahead and open the floor. But if not, we'll be meeting again in December. And I wanted to throw it out there to see if anyone was up for an in-person meeting instead of a virtual one. And Erica, you mentioned your spot. Maybe that would be a good place for us to meet.
I had one additional follow-up. Earlier, Tom mentioned the shipwreck study in Tampa Bay. So we did that study. And, if anything, it's an underestimate in certain areas, particularly where it's very shallow or confined, because then the wake dynamics change and they become, because you have a limited amount of water over which the wake energy can act. So you get more extreme, and that wasn't fully taken into account in that report. I just thought I'd mention that.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm not sure how to do a vote in GoToMeeting. Jamie had a suggestion that we do a vote, yay or nay, for in-person meeting, but maybe if folks can just go down to the bottom and raise your hand if you're up for an in-person meeting for December, then we'll get an idea of, kind of who would be interested in that.
And while people are voting, I think one of the questions I have, and maybe y'all already got this out of the discussion, but I'm curious, especially from our presenters and other people that have done similar work, what are the main barriers that you're facing? Is it always permitting? Is it something else? I think I just want to hear from y'all.
I'll say so, Jessica. Our situation here at the college is you know, I have one entity that's the college, and then I have another entity that's like Swift Mud, and then I have a construction permit, and then, you know, there's a lot of overlaps of different kinds of permits. And so sometimes an agency like the college doesn't necessarily know how all of those work together. Yeah. And yeah, I don't know, maybe there's some kind of resource that can be, I don't know, that exists online about all the current stuff, you know, that's related to living shorelines. You know, there was a big deal here in the college because the construction guys from the 40s were like, it has to be a seawall. The whole world will fall into the ocean if you take out the seawall. I know Tom was in a lot of those meetings, so I'm sure. So a resource.
Yeah, is that one of the barriers, is perception of people to think that like a seawall is a requirement for maintenance of that shoreline, you know?
Yeah, I think that that was a big hurdle for us to overcome, and explaining to them all of the different, you know, aspects. And so I have had a few homeowners reach out and ask who are around here, because they were like, oh my gosh, it's amazing, it's beautiful, we love seeing all that interface over there, and how are you keeping the sand from falling into the ocean and eventually the building? And it's, you know, it's not how it works. But so yeah, some information and background about that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, it is an issue because people, first of all, don't even know there's an option, right? You buy a house on the water, you've never really lived that, your seawall is failing, you call the seawall repair guy, right? And they're only going to talk about replacing that. Even though we've done a lot of classes around the state to marine contractors showing them there's a whole another line of business. Some are open, some are fighting it. It's an education thing for homeowners and just the public to understand there's an option. And the biggest part of that option is convincing them that they work. That's why putting in these demo sites are really powerful, because you could send somebody and say, hey, you can go to Felipe Park and see what you can do in front of your seawall, or you can go down to Apollo Beach FWC Youth Conservation Area, and there's a demo project that shows all these limited shoreline options in one place, and you can see it in real life. And I think that's a really, it's our job to try and convince and to let people know there's options and that they work. And then the next thing is the permitting.
So just being mindful of everyone's time, we are past our 3:30 timing, but you know, we can continue to chat. A few folks said yes to in person. I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and send out a poll to the Habitat Restoration email list. We'll get a consensus on, you know, whether folks are interested in person or virtual, and then also, you know, what kind of theme we want to go with for the next time. I think this has been really useful. You know, having different themes for each of these meetings. We've had oysters, we've had living shorelines now. Maybe we could do potentially uplands or freshwater wetlands, you know, for upcoming meetings. So I'll throw out a poll to folks to see if we can get a consensus on that. And it looks like there's another comment in the chat. It looks like MacDill is looking for a new natural and cultural resources managers. You can talk to Sinead about that if you're interested.
All right. Well, thank you to all of our presenters. I do have to leave. So thank you everyone for your participation. Much appreciated.
All right.
Good to see
Thank you
everybody.
very much.
Thanks, Carrie. Great job. And to the presenters. Really enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks, Greg.